My dear child, there are certain moments that arrive quietly in the middle of the night, yet they carry such a profound weight that everything surrounding them can begin to feel completely different before anyone can truly understand why. Last night was one of those rare and heavy moments. Something shifted within the absolute silence, and even if no one has spoken about it yet, even if this morning appeared completely normal to everyone else, what happened during those unseen hours has already touched the very heart of the person you love so deeply. Do not skip this, because something truly important is waiting for you. You may have noticed a strange feeling of distance, a small hesitation in their voice, a slower response to your messages, or a look in their eyes that seemed both present and somewhere far away at the same time. Please understand that it is not simply your imagination. Some nights leave behind marks so deep that words struggle to explain them. Some hours move by like ordinary darkness, yet they return carrying thoughts powerful enough to rearrange emotions that have been hidden for an incredibly long time. And last night, while the rest of the world was sleeping peacefully, that person found themselves alone with thoughts they had been desperately attempting to avoid. There was no crowd surrounding them. There was no noise capable of drowning them out. There was no distraction powerful enough to silence the truth that suddenly rose within their heart. A memory came back without warning. A feeling they had believed they could completely control appeared once again, stronger than before, clearer than it had ever been, and now it had become impossible to ignore. Stay with me until the very end, because what started last night is still unfolding and becoming stronger at this very moment. They found themselves remembering conversations they had never previously admitted were important. They replayed moments they had once treated as insignificant, only to discover in the quiet that those moments had actually become unforgettable pieces of their life. A single detail, the particular sound of a voice, a simple gesture, or a sentence that had once been spoken casually, all of it came rushing back at once. And suddenly, the night no longer felt like an ordinary night. What changed everything was not some dramatic event taking place outside of them. It was what happened deep within their own soul. For the first time in a very long while, they stopped pretending to themselves. That is precisely why the energy surrounding them feels so unfamiliar today. That is why even if they speak with you normally, something beneath the surface has become heavier, deeper, and far more uncertain. Because when someone finally confronts what they have been hiding from their own heart, they simply cannot remain exactly the same when the next morning comes.
Do not skip now, because the next part matters even more than you realize. There was a specific moment last night when they almost reached out and sent words they had never been brave enough to share. There was a moment when they nearly broke the silence they had protected for far too long. Their thoughts moved closer to complete honesty than they ever had before. And although they stopped themselves, the decision they formed within did not disappear. Something inside them has begun asking difficult questions that they can no longer push away. Why does one person continue to remain in their thoughts, even during the quietest hours? Why does the distance between you suddenly feel much heavier than it once did? Why do ordinary memories now feel like signs that they should no longer ignore? These questions did not simply disappear when the morning light arrived. That is why today carries such an unusual weight. Because when a person begins questioning what their heart has been trying so hard to protect, change begins slowly. But it begins with undeniable strength. Something huge is waiting for you, because the night did not simply end when the clock moved forward. That night is continuing through every thought they are carrying today. There is even more to this. A detail appeared last night that they never expected to encounter. It may have been a word they heard, a face they happened to see, or a reminder they never planned to receive. But whatever it was, it opened something old that had remained unfinished. Suddenly, what they had kept locked away became impossible to simply dismiss. And in that moment, they understood that pretending nothing matters is far more difficult than admitting that something truly does.
This is why their silence now means much more than it did before. Silence is not simply emptiness. Sometimes, silence is the very place where the loudest and most important decisions are being created. Stay until the end, because you have not yet discovered where this path is leading. They may appear perfectly calm to the outside world, but inwardly, they are standing between two incredibly powerful directions. One direction tells them to remain exactly as they have always been, while the other tells them that after what happened last night, remaining unchanged may no longer be possible. That internal conflict is much stronger than anyone around them could ever know. Because some realizations appear only once in a lifetime. Some nights reveal only one truth. But sometimes, that one truth is more than enough to transform every day that comes afterward. And last night gave them a truth they were not prepared to face. Certain feelings do not simply vanish because they were ignored, denied, or pushed aside. They return with greater intensity when the heart finally becomes quiet enough to hear them. Do not skip, because what you are sensing right now is only the beginning of the story. Even now, while the hours continue passing, they are carefully choosing and measuring words inside their mind. They are imagining possibilities they previously refused to consider at all. They are wondering whether the silence they have maintained truly protected them, or whether it simply delayed something that was always destined to surface. The person you love deeply may not be capable of explaining this to you immediately. They might not even completely understand why they suddenly feel so different, but the difference is absolutely real. And sometimes, the strongest transformation begins long before anyone says a single sentence aloud. Last night did not create something entirely new. It revealed something that had already been growing quietly inside them for much longer than they ever expected. That is why today feels so unusual to you. That is why what happens next may even surprise them. Something huge is waiting for you, because when a heart changes during silence, the next visible step often appears at the exact moment you least expect it. And whatever decision they make after carrying the weight of last night inside them may soon become impossible for them to continue ignoring. What happened after that silent night became even more unusual as the morning hours began moving forward. Because sometimes a person does not immediately understand their own heart. They only begin noticing that ordinary things no longer feel ordinary. The person you love deeply entered today, carrying thoughts they never expected to still be holding on to. Even the simplest moments felt heavier than they had before. Familiar places looked exactly the way they had always looked, yet something deep within them was responding differently to everything happening around them. Do not skip this part, because it explains exactly why their silence has become far more meaningful than anyone may realize. There was a moment today when they stopped for no obvious reason at all. It was only a short pause, something nobody else would have noticed, yet internally it carried an incredible amount of power. During that particular pause, the memory of last night came back to them once again, but this time it felt clearer than it had before. It did not return as simple confusion anymore, but as something they could no longer force themselves to ignore. They attempted to concentrate on other things. They tried to continue with their normal daily routine, but certain thoughts continued coming back with an unusual and almost impossible to resist strength. That is how genuine emotional changes often begin. Not through some loud announcement or dramatic moment, but through repeated waves of feeling that eventually become impossible to push aside. Stay with me until the end, because something huge is waiting for you. A sentence they once dismissed now sounds completely different whenever they remember it. A moment from the past that they once believed was insignificant suddenly feels meaningful and important. Even the words they never completely answered now appear to carry an entirely new meaning for them. What has changed is not the past itself,
but the depth with which they are finally beginning to understand it. And when someone starts looking back at old moments with a new and more honest heart, they begin to recognize what they should have understood much earlier. That realization is exactly why their expression today may appear thoughtful, distant, or unusually quiet. Because somewhere inside them, something is still unfolding. Something is still developing. They are beginning to question whether last night was simply a temporary emotional experience, or whether it exposed a truth they have been postponing and refusing to admit for far too long. Do not skip now, because this next truth matters deeply. There are certain moments when people suddenly realize that someone has taken up far more space within their heart than they ever planned or intended. They may not immediately tell you what they have realized. They might even continue resisting the feeling for some time. But once that awareness finally appears, everything begins connecting in ways they had previously failed to notice. That is precisely the place where they find themselves right now. A small reminder today made everything feel even stronger. It might have been hearing a particular name, noticing something familiar, remembering a shared detail, or simply sitting quietly long enough for the truth to rise back to the surface. Whatever triggered it, the emotion became increasingly difficult for them to ignore. And now, what they once believed would eventually disappear is becoming clearer, stronger, and more persistent. Something huge is waiting for you, because what they are experiencing is no longer remaining hidden in the same way it once did. And there is another major reason why this matters so much. Last night did not simply bring strong emotions. It also created a period of intense inner reflection. They looked much further back into their past than they originally expected. They remembered moments when they decided to remain silent, even though they could have spoken. They remembered the times they chose to step away, even though they could have stayed closer to you. They thought about how frequently their fear of uncertainty became stronger than their desire to be honest. And for perhaps the first time, that reflection did not give them any sense of comfort. Instead, it left them with a quiet but sobering realization that some distances are not created because feelings are missing, but because those feelings were never expressed clearly enough. Stay until the end, because the next shift has already started. Today, while everyone around them may see absolutely nothing unusual, they are internally comparing what they once believed with what they are now beginning to feel. That comparison is slowly transforming their entire perspective. They are noticing how often your presence remained somewhere in their thoughts without any clear explanation. They are recognizing how certain memories refuse to disappear regardless of how hard they tried to move beyond them. They are realizing that even after attempting to continue with their ordinary life, something unfinished kept finding its way back into their mind. That unfinished feeling became much harder to deny after what happened last night. Do not skip this, because once someone reaches this particular point, their next choices rarely come simply from routine or habit. They begin making decisions based on what their heart has finally accepted. And hearts do not reach that level of acceptance without a reason. It requires repeated reminders. It requires quiet and lonely nights. It requires one particular moment that suddenly makes every hidden thought too powerful to continue ignoring. That moment has already happened. This is why they may appear slower today, more thoughtful, more cautious with every word, and more present within their silence than within their conversations. Something inside them is trying to determine whether what they have kept hidden and contained for so long can truly remain contained for much longer. Something huge is waiting for you. Because when someone begins questioning the reason behind their own silence, change is already moving much closer than they expected. Even now, they are not completely comfortable with what they have discovered inside themselves. One part of them still wants complete certainty before making any kind of move. Another part continues wondering whether what they feel should remain unspoken forever. But there is another part of them, a part that has grown stronger than it has ever been before,
that is no longer willing to remain satisfied with keeping that distance. And that stronger part was awakened by what happened during the night. What comes next may not appear in some loud or dramatic form. It might begin through something incredibly small, a different tone in their voice, a message that arrives slightly later than usual, a sudden increase in curiosity, an unexpected openness toward you, a subtle change in the way they respond when your name comes up. These small signs often appear before the larger changes become visible to everyone else. Stay until the end, because this unfolding process has only just reached its beginning. The person you love deeply may still appear completely familiar to everyone around them, but internally, they are no longer standing in precisely the same place where they stood yesterday. A thought entered their mind today that had never felt quite this serious or this heavy before. What if the silence has already continued for much longer than it ever should have? That single thought can change a great many things. And once it enters someone's mind deeply enough, it rarely disappears without creating some kind of movement. There is something even more surprising about what is happening right now. The further this day moves forward, the more difficult it becomes for them to return to the emotional state they were in before last night. What initially appeared to be nothing more than a temporary emotional moment is gradually becoming something much more lasting, something more serious, something far more difficult for them to hide, even from themselves. Do not skip any of this, because this is the exact point where everything begins to feel different for them. At one point earlier today, they genuinely tried to distract themselves completely. They attempted to fill their mind with ordinary responsibilities, familiar routines, and anything that might prevent them from thinking about what had happened. But despite those efforts, the same realization continued returning. The more they tried to push it away, the more clearly it seemed to come back. They may have looked completely normal from the outside. They may have spoken to people, completed their responsibilities, smiled when necessary, and continued moving through the day as though nothing had changed. But internally, something had shifted. And sometimes the most powerful emotional changes are the ones nobody else can see. They are not necessarily ready to explain everything yet. They are still processing what they feel, what last night revealed, and what your presence continues to awaken inside them. But one thing has become increasingly difficult for them to deny. Whatever exists between you has not disappeared simply because there has been silence. In fact, the silence may have made them hear it more clearly. There are feelings that become quieter when ignored, but there are other feelings that become stronger. They become more noticeable in the stillness. They appear in unexpected memories, random thoughts, familiar places, songs, names, conversations, and moments when the mind finally becomes quiet enough to reveal what the heart has been holding. That is what seems to be happening now. They are beginning to recognize that distance did not necessarily erase the connection they felt. It may have only given them enough space to finally understand its importance. And this realization can be uncomfortable because accepting the truth means they may also have to confront their own decisions. They may have to ask themselves why they remained silent for so long, why they allowed uncertainty to control them, why they walked away from moments when honesty might have changed everything. Those questions do not always have easy answers, but they are asking them now. And once a person begins asking those questions sincerely, it becomes much harder to continue pretending that everything is exactly as it was before. That is why their energy may feel different today. Their silence may feel heavier. Their presence may seem more distant, while simultaneously carrying more emotion. They are caught between what they have always done and what they are now beginning to understand. Part of them wants to protect itself from disappointment. Part of them fears making the wrong decision. Part of them wonders what would happen if they finally allowed themselves to be honest. But another part of them is becoming tired of running from the same truth. And that is where the real shift begins. Not necessarily with a confession, not necessarily with an immediate message, not necessarily with some dramatic return. It begins internally. It begins when someone finally becomes honest with themselves. And right now, that honesty is becoming harder for them to avoid. The memory of last night may have opened a door they had kept closed for a very long time. Today, they are standing near that door, looking at everything they previously tried not to see. They are remembering what they felt. They are remembering what they did not say. They are remembering what they could have done differently. And most importantly, they are beginning to understand why the connection continues to occupy their mind, even after so much time has passed. Something inside them is changing, slowly, quietly, but deeply. And the reason their silence feels different now is because it is no longer simply the silence of avoidance. It may be the silence of someone trying to understand a truth that has finally become too significant to ignore. So if you have felt that something has shifted, do not immediately assume that nothing is happening simply because you cannot see an obvious external sign. Sometimes, the biggest movement happens before anything becomes visible. Sometimes, a person has to experience the entire emotional realization internally before they can express even a small part of it outwardly. And that process appears to be happening right now. The night changed something. Today reinforced it. And what comes next may reveal just how deeply that change has already taken root inside them. They went through their normal conversations, handled their usual everyday responsibilities, and heard the familiar sounds surrounding them. Yet none of those things were strong enough to drown out the truth that had already awakened somewhere deep within. That is because when a thought reaches the heart at precisely the right moment, ordinary distractions suddenly lose their ability to matter. And what kept coming back to them was not simply some random thought that appeared and disappeared. It was your presence in their mind. But this time, something about it felt completely different because it was no longer only a memory. It carried meaning. And that was the part they genuinely never expected. Stay with me until the very end, because something powerful is waiting for you. For such a long time, they may have convinced themselves that certain emotions were only temporary, something that would eventually disappear if they ignored them for long enough. But last night completely challenged that belief. Last night made them experience just how deeply certain emotions can remain, even after long stretches of silence, distance, uncertainty, and hesitation. That realization followed them into today like an unfinished thought they could not seem to complete. Every time they believed they had finally moved away from that feeling, it somehow returned again. One tiny detail suddenly carried enormous weight. They started comparing the way they feel today with the way they felt before, and the difference became something they could no longer deny. Before last night, they could still tell themselves that nothing meaningful had really changed. But after last night, that explanation simply does not feel believable anymore. Do not skip this part, because the next truth matters even more. There are uncommon moments when someone suddenly realizes that another person has quietly become a permanent part of their emotional world without any official decision ever being made. There was no major announcement. There was no carefully prepared plan. There was no dramatic event that forced this realization. There was simply one powerful understanding that arrived all at once and completely changed the way they looked at everything around them. And that is precisely what they are dealing with right now. Because this realization came so unexpectedly, they are trying to examine it as carefully as possible. They keep asking themselves why one particular thought refuses to disappear. Why does one person continue showing up in their quietest moments? Why do certain memories now seem brighter instead of slowly disappearing into the background? Why has one emotional change from a single night remained so powerful throughout the entire day? The answer is becoming clearer to them than it has ever been before. Something huge is waiting for you, because when someone reaches that kind of inner clarity, changes on the outside
are usually not very far away. There was another quiet moment today that mattered far more than anyone around them could possibly understand. They imagined what their life would feel like if absolutely nothing changed from this moment onward. That thought did not make them feel peaceful. Instead, it created a deep and unexpected discomfort. It was the kind of discomfort that appears when the heart finally recognizes that continuing to remain silent may no longer feel easier than finally speaking the truth. That internal discomfort matters because it shows that their silence is slowly losing the feeling of safety it once provided. And when silence no longer feels safe, a person begins moving much closer toward complete honesty.